Hello. Good morning, Trenton. I just wanted to stop in this morning and say hello and let you in on some stuff that I've been working on. I'm still working on the history of our family and some of those old ancient ancestors. And this morning I wanted to talk about a fellow named Joseph Thurman of Bedford, Virginia. Now, this Joseph Thurman, we're going to say he's the older, because later on we'll talk about another Joseph Thurman, and we've got a whole lot of stories about the other Joseph Thurman, the younger. Although both of them were really old and way back in the family tree. But when you start talking about the Thurman family, there really isn't any better place to start than with Joseph. He is, after all, the oldest generation of Thurman that we are aware of. Now, I don't know exactly where he came from, but we first found him in the historical record around 1790. Now, that's 225 years ago. And at that time, his future mother-in-law, which was a woman named Mary Ann Franklin, felt it necessary to swear a peace bond out on him in order to guarantee his good behavior. Now, I'm not really sure what the behavior was that he was being accused of, but I suspect it had something to do with Mary Ann's daughter, Nancy Franklin, because in about 3 more years, Joseph and Nancy got married. They started their own family a year later with a young man named Baby Jabez, and we will also talk about Jabez along the way, and later on here. But he was born, that was 1795. Now, most men, when they get a wife and family, you'd think they might settle down. At least, we hope they would. But in this case, I'm afraid Joseph Thurman continued to find trouble. The court records show that he got into a bad argument with a man named William Hudnall in March of 1797. Now, things were so bad that Mr. Hudnall swore out another of them peace bonds to try and guarantee good behavior from our Joseph Thurman. Now, Joseph, he didn't really have enough money of his own to post this bond, and a couple of his friends named Robert Craig and William Dabney, they put up the bond equally on his behalf. But I'm sure they were also just equally disappointed a couple of months later when Joseph got into yet another altercation with William Hudnall, and this time it was so bad that Joseph was accused of biting off William Hudnall's nose. So a trial was, in fact, forthcoming. And it started being worked on back in August. Now, during these proceedings, we don't know all that happened, but we do know that Joseph managed to escape conviction. In the process of defending himself, he got fined twice for swearing in court, where they counted some 22 separate offenses of that swearing. However, so if he's caught and convicted of that, how did he escape this other conviction? Well, the records aren't real clear. However, it looks like what happened is that Joseph Thurman gathered up his young family, crossed over the Appalachian Mountains to Blount County, Tennessee, and just simply moved on, which was not uncommon in those days, because once one crossed over the mountains and whatnot, it would get pretty far removed from the local jurisdiction, and it was often a way for people to gain themselves a fresh start. Now, the dismissal in court of the charges, where that comes from, I imagine, is that Robert Craig and William Dabney, who were very disappointed at this departure, at this turn of events, and had put up that peace bond, I think that they had enough pull with the court to get those charges dismissed so they would not forfeit their property on that bond. Now, once Joseph and the family moved on over to Tennessee, they had a new chance at a fresh start. You know, Joseph, he had been getting in a lot of trouble. But it just wasn't going to happen that way. And in the first couple of years, the following events took place. First, he got another peace bond swore out against him. This time it was another woman he had been bullying. And her name was Catherine McCammon. That wasn't all. He also found himself on the wrong side of a lawsuit with a fellow named William Cowan. And, you know, I'm not real positive what happened to Mr. Cowan. Maybe Joseph got lucky. Or maybe Joseph made a little of his own luck. But Mr. Cowan apparently died a few months later. And there was a notation in the court book that his two sons tried to appeal the decision, but it kind of looks like the case died right alongside Mr. Cowan, which would not be unusual, seeing as how I'm sure Mr. Cowan was needed for his witness on his behalf. Now, things kind of settled down, at least as far as the record goes, and it seems as if Joseph finally maintained a little bit of respectability. He served on a jury, and he was appointed to be the constable of his district. Now, some people just aren't cut out to be a constable or a person of the law, and I think that might have been the case with Joseph, because it was only a couple of months after he got that appointment that he was fined 50 cents on account of that constant swearing he was doing. And then a couple of months later, we find where Joseph was suspended from acting as constable long before his term would have naturally expired. And we don't know what kind of trouble that was or what kind of events it was caused. I wouldn't want to speculate about Mr. Cowan's sons. But within the next month or two, Joseph died. Now, he had gotten himself into plenty of scrapes, and he was living in a tough frontier community. But he was a young man, and we presume that he very likely died violently. It just seems like that's the way he was determined to live, and maybe that's the way he died. So before the end of the year, his will was being probated. His property was being sold off to cover all his debts. He didn't have a lot of property. But his poor young children, one of which just happened to be Jabez, was, Jabez must have been about 9 or 10 years old. And what happened to him is that the court decided it would be in his best interest to go out as an apprentice for a fellow named Pat Fitzgerald. Now, Mr. Fitzgerald then promised to learn him to read and write and learn the tailor's trade. We'll talk about Jabez later, but I think it might be kind of nice to note right here at this point that Pat Fitzgerald might also have been, quite possibly, Jabez's stepfather, because we believe that he also married Nancy within a year or two of that. Now, oddly enough, there are a number of genealogists and researchers in the Thurman family through the years who don't recognize old Joseph Thurman as their ancestor. Now, I can imagine somebody not really wanting to claim relation from this fine, upstanding fellow like old Joseph Thurman. But unfortunately for them, the evidence here is fairly solid, and I always leave these decisions up to the records of my mother, Shunky Lynch. And even though she's been dead for about 15 years now, I know from her records that she accepted the truth of Joseph's connection a long time ago, and so we will also. After all, as we get to know these Thurmans a bit, we'll find out that they could be, at times, a little bit rough around the edges and got into plenty of scrapes through the years. It's kind of believable that they might have got their start from a fella named Joseph Thurman of Bedford County, Virginia.